Oh, yeah. Collection. Getting those information on Zoom YouTube later. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce tonight, speaking on the subject of building the psychology of entrepreneurship, Gina Gordon. Gina is a assistant professor of psychology at the Furkoff School of Graduate Studies in Psychology in part of Yeshiva University. Furkoff Graduate School of Psychology at Yeshiva University. And has been working with entrepreneurs and founders, in particular as part of an incubator. As we all are these days with Zoom and messages. It's also a particular pleasure to be Gina, whom I met shortly before, I think, in my first professional talk at a conference that she was attending as a high school student. And I've seen her develop into a very entrepreneurial researcher and thinker. And psychologist. If a novice but I don't know about doing better. There's people online that pop up dialogue box on one of our students. Anyway, very excited to have Gina here talking. And
thank you very much, Greg. Pleasure to be here to speak to you all on building the psychology of entrepreneurship. So first, just a word about how I came to be talking to this topic. As Greg mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist by profession and training, and until fairly recently, I was mostly focused on researching and treating things like depression and anxiety and other mental health disorders. So why am I up here giving you a talk about the psychology of entrepreneurship? True, I've been married to entrepreneurship literally and figuratively for quite some time now, but the impetus for making this a more explicit career focus was really the global pandemic that I recently lived through or have been living through, and in particular, just how poorly prepared we were as a society and as a species, I would say, for an event like COVID-19. I was particularly inspired by some of the urgent calls for more aggressive innovation and technological progress to increase our resilience against future threats of this sort. For example, you may have seen, and I'm going to direct you to this screen, you may have seen this piece by venture capitalist Mark Andreessen that went viral in April 2020, almost exactly 2 years ago today, where he enjoins us that it's time to build. Just to quote from the article a little bit, our nation and our civilization were built on production, on building. Our forefathers and foremothers built roads and trains, farms and factories, then the computer, the microchip, the smartphone, and uncounted thousands of other things that we now take for granted, that are all around us, that define our lives and provide for our well-being. There's only one way to honor their legacy and to create the future we want for our children and grandchildren, and that's to build. There were many calls of this sort and many echoes of this and the progress movement really has taken off in these years. But this sentiment really resonated with me, and it also really struck me, someone who works with individuals who are trying to do really ambitious things. Being a builder is really hard. If you want to build something really new and ambitious, it's really, really hard. In ways that, at least on the surface, look and sound very similar to struggling with depression or anxiety. So this is Ben Horowitz, who happens to be the other co-founder of the venture capital firm at Recent Horowitz, who eloquently captures here in his book, A Hard Thing About Hard Things, what he calls the struggle. according to Horowitz, this struggle is universal among great entrepreneurs, and it is unsparing. Right? Just to quote a few bits from this excerpt from an even longer description. The struggle is where self-doubt becomes self-hatred. It's when you want the pain to stop. It's the land of broken promises and crushed dreams. It's where your guts boil so much that you feel like you're going to spit blood, and so on. And as he goes on to, struggle is where greatness comes from. Now, I'm not sure that I fully agree with him on this last point. The struggle may or may not literally be where greatness comes from, and it may or may not be strictly necessary for every great entrepreneur to experience it in quite this form. But I think he's undoubtedly right that most great entrepreneurs, in fact, have experienced some form of this struggle. And that at least some part of the struggle is due not to anything at all wrong with them, but to the very nature of the consequences. Actually scary and risky and uncertain and hard. So in this life, it turns out entrepreneurs need a lot of psychological support, which both in some ways like and in other ways unlike the kind of support we have on offer for things like depression and anxiety, ADHD, and other mental health disorders. The struggle in this case isn't inherently disorder, right? It's at least partly a reflection of the real responsibility and risk that you take on when you choose to build something truly great and new, and to lead other people in building it with you, and borrow other people's money in order to do so. Stakeholders who depend on your credibility as someone who promises that they will deliver value over time. Most successful entrepreneurs have failed at least a few times, or so many times. Some of those failures have been really big and really painful. You might even reasonably call them catastrophic. Most of them have been turned down by countless investors who have told them that their vision doesn't make sense, that it's unrealistic, that it's premature, that it's undercooked, that it'll never take off. And sometimes they've been right. And most of them have had the experience of having to tell investors who did invest in their company that they've spent all the money and have nothing to show for it. So a lot of the work that I've been doing, especially these last couple of years, is really trying to understand what it takes psychologically to navigate some of the real challenges, what it looks like on the ground, educating myself about the entrepreneurial journey. And also kind of what it takes to build oneself into the person who is really adept at handling those kinds of challenges, for seeing it through. And not only that, but who can actually enjoy it, who can actually come out on the other side a happier person than if they've never taken it on. Who can actually, for whom the payoff can also be personally great. And of course, ultimately, I want to know, how do we cultivate whatever mindsets, whatever characteristics, whatever psychological skills and tools are going to help more builders to build. This is my answer to Andreessen's calling. I'm trying to build builders. And so today I want to share with you some of my distilled takeaways so far from this venture that I've been on. It's based on a mix of some very early, very pilot, original empirical research, working with actual startup founders, mostly at an incubator in Europe, and then some others here and there, which I'm happy to say more about. Period. Also, really an incorporation and a synthesis of my own informal observations, working with not just founders, but other ambitious people trying to build things, trying to innovate, as well as the accumulated knowledge that I've developed through my own study of both psychology and business literature. And all of this is a work in progress in the spirit of our topic today. And I hope that you will help me to improve it with your question. Let's get building together. So with that said, First, I want to provide a framework that will hopefully allow me to achieve this ambitious task of boiling down a whole lot of different tools, insights, recommendations that I've been sort of cataloging and providing to founders by boiling it all down to a couple of mindsets. So when I say a mindset, what I mean here is a kind of internalized perspective on the world, on yourself, on life as a whole, right? Like you could imagine articulating it in a couple of sentences, but it shows up in everything that we do, right? This goes by different names in different parts of psychology, philosophy, call it an internal working model, call it your metaphysical value arguments for those like that terminology. Right. But whatever it is, it's an internalized, psychologically ingrained lens through which you see the world. And I think a lot of what I've learned, what I've observed, can sort of be boiled down to a difference in the mindset that someone is operating from. So to provide some context for this, I want to describe to you a couple of very common mindsets that come up a lot in my work with entrepreneurs, in my life, in talking to other ambitious people, particularly when dealing with the kinds of setbacks or challenges or self-doubts that Horowitz was describing as the struggle. Here are the two mindsets that I have in mind. And these are just names I'm giving them for purposes of being able to talk about them and describe them with no insult intended to any actual literal drill sergeants out there or Zen masters out there who may or may not resemble any part of this mindset. These are kind of cultural stereotypes that I'm deliberately exploiting to some extent to get at what I think is a kind of underlying risk. Okay, so first, we have the drill sergeant. I think I'm going to take a guess. We'll chat with them. I'm guessing that lots of people in this room, just given where we are, this is a prestigious university. You're here to listen to a lecture that's optional. I assume for all of you, you're really ambitious and high-minded people. So you probably encountered the drill sergeant somewhere in your life. So the drill sergeant is that unforgiving voice of judgment and reproach, whose sole focus seems to be on getting you to succeed. Right? It's the voice in your head that says things like, "Get to work already, you lazy bleep," or this is the important right? Or what the hell is wrong with you? You should have already been so far ahead of where you are with this task. You'll never be good enough. You'll never live up to your own image of the really accomplished entrepreneur. More specifically, I want to sort of look at some of the distinct characteristics of this mindset kind of as pertaining to different issues that you have different kind of views on. So in terms of the motivational focus, like what are you sort of focused on trying to attain, kind of what gets you going, where is your energy directed? So the drill sergeant is really concerned with outcomes, results, right? It's all about making the grade. It's about raising the funds. It's about getting the promotion. That's what matters, and however you get there, and it doesn't matter if you've got to stay up late and you've got to really, sort of grind it out. It doesn't matter if, you're burnt out, whatever, suck it up, Girl Scout, get it done, right? It's really kind of outcome over process. The temporal orientation is at least often characterized as being kind of future focus, right? It's all about like future you and what future you will achieve, and you're putting in the time and the energy now for the sake of that future you. It's like that kind of catchphrase, like you can be happy when you're dead, right? Like first you got to earn it, first you got to work for it. In terms of just the style of self-talk, like how it tends to sound in our own heads, or out of our heads if somebody is approaching us in this manner, as a manager, as a mentor, whatever. It's pretty stern. It's pretty critical, as you probably already noticed, right? It's pretty harsh. It's kind of focused on what isn't going right, focused on correcting mistakes, not necessarily going to be patting you on the back, giving you in terms of the working style that we associate with the drill sergeant approach, or kind of the working style that it's pulling for, and that people with this kind of voice in their heads tend to at least want to exhibit, right? It's very driven, it's ambitious, it's perfectionistic, right? This is like the classic type A kind of personality that's associated with this mindset, right? So you gotta dot every I and cross every T, and if there's an A+ level grade, then you should get the A+ grade. Don't settle for the A, right? If there's another promotion, you should be going for that promotion. Don't just settle for second best, right? And then in terms of the thinking style, and these of course all overlap, but these are kind of my mostly made up labels that probably don't separate that cleanly, but to kind of just paint or sketch some of the dimensions of this mindset. I think generally we get the flavor of a kind of structured, rule-based, methodical, systematic thought process, decision-making approach. Right? You need to have reasons for why you did what you did, and you've got to think it through using some sort of decisional framework, and you've got to be able to back it up. Yeah. So, is this resonating with anybody? Do you know people who you would say generally they kind of tend to exhibit, manifest this style of self or other management, motivation? Feel familiar? Raise your hand if you have a drill sergeant inside of you. Some, if not all of the time. I'm among them. Okay. So, as you might know, having lived with your own drill sergeants for whatever stretch of your life, it can get pretty exhausting sometimes. It can be painful and demoralizing, right? And sometimes we outright want to rebel. Right? We just want to cast off the domineering kind of voice of judgment that just never lets us rest, never lets us celebrate, relax in the experience of what we've already accomplished. So in response, we'll often get this kind of or this kind of approach that might be recommended to us, whether by coaches or counselors or colleagues or wherever it is that we find it. This is offered up at least as some kind of an alternative to constantly being tyrannized by the drill sergeant. So what's the Zen mindset about? The Zen mindset sort of flips things around, right? It's not about the outcomes, it's about the process. It's about the journey, not the destination, right? Enjoy the ride. Enjoy the experience, right? The effort that you're putting in. You can't fully control what happens anyway, but you can control how hard you try. You can control your own sort of focus and energy and attitude, right? So focus on the things you can control. Focus on the process. In terms of temporal orientation, it tends to be more present focused, right? The moment is all we ever have. Take it in, experience the ride, right? Don't be so worried about where you're going that you don't even know you've been there, right? We hear a lot of this kind of thing. It tends to be more kind, more accepting, more patient, more compassionate, right? Like, look, nobody's perfect, it'll say, right? You've given your best effort. It doesn't matter if you failed, it matters that you tried. Get back up again. You can always try again, right? It's kind, it's encouraging, it's not so judgmental, it's not so focused on evaluating, it's more focused on supporting. And in terms of the working style, it's a little bit more chill, right? Like it's a little bit more sort of be content, put in a day's work, but don't drive yourself, to the ground. There's a lot of talk if you've ever gone and studied or practiced certain kinds of meditation, mindfulness, transcendental meditation. There's this kind of language of non-striving, non-doing, being mode rather than doing mode. Just sort of being able to kind of just drop into the stillness of experience kind of underneath all the hullabaloo of day-to-day life and of the things you're trying to achieve and of stress and goals. Just being, right? And for just being able to kind of drop down and to be in contact with that part of your experience so that you don't get too sort of invested, too carried away with constantly being part of that rat race trying to get to the next level. In terms of the thinking style, there's more room for creativity here, right? There's more of a kind of an encouragement to think more freely, to kind of follow your intuition where it leads, to be a little bit more associative, intuitive, right? Go with the flow. So I'm going to pause here again, and I want to see if, as you think about, especially like people you know, people you've encountered, whether personally or in history and literature, you would regard as builders, as embodying the, however you understand kind of the builders. Where do they fall with respect to these mindsets? And like, what do you think about this? Are these two opposite forces? Do you find that they seem to be answers to each other? Do they, interesting.
Well, I mean, it's hard to say because I do think I've encountered people that have like some of these things, and it's hard to know, like, do they really have all those things? I'm not always like with friends or whatever when they're working, so I can have like some indication. But one thing that strikes me is that I do think I've noticed a lot of people who seem to have a lot of the Zen mindset aspects, but are still quite driven and still quite ambitious. So I don't really see the connection between the process over outcome and present-oriented view and like how that's separate from being driven, because I actually do find those things going together a lot.
Interesting.
Because, and just to like clarify that a bit more, especially because a lot of people who are basically okay with failing a lot, so they're not like obsessed about the outcome because they know that as long as they're growing and making progress, that's really what matters. But they're still driven by the growth or by like an ambitious goal, but they're just not obsessed with the outcome in terms of their motivation.
Interesting. So you've seen a synthesis of these two.
I think so, yeah.
Cool. Anyone else have a similar or different?
It's really interesting, and I'm excited to see where this goes next. I'm the director of the Entrepreneurship minor here.
Cool.
And so we have 900 students who are trying to teach entrepreneurship mindset. And as we think about these things, we learn about Steve Jobs, and we can stereotype Elon Musk. And I imagine
They're both going to appear.
That they would have mostly the drill sergeant mindset. But then again, was Tristan?
Yeah.
What Tristan said about process over outcome, I think they're okay with failure over product. So kind of interested to see how maybe it's going to be all of these things. That's my prediction in your presentation, but also like a couple of comments personally, like I've studied abroad in Norway and found in my graduate studies, like there's more Zen mindset in Europe and more drill sergeant mindset in the US. And we're in graduation season, which is my favorite season of the year. And so we see a lot of drill sergeant mindset for 15 weeks or 30 weeks at a time. And then now we're going to have all these graduation speeches that are going to be all Zen mindset.
Swing.
And you're like, actually, it's not how it actually happens, but I appreciate the Zen mindset as we have drinks and watch the fireworks. So, and then myself, I'm very much drill sergeant mindset with the relationship with my work self. But with my students, I tend to try to teach the Zen this is so valuable. Thank you.
And you're shutting me up. And also, I can talk afterwards about teaching wisdom insights. Anybody else have any thoughts before I spoke the clock?
I'm kind of on the same page where, for me, it feels kind of like a sliding scale, where it's like, nobody's completely Zen or completely drill sergeant mindset. I also feel like it definitely depends on like the situation. Like for me, I'm very like a Zen mindset, but when it comes to like, exams or like when you're like talking to maybe a potential client, it goes to like the drill sergeant mindset, right? Because it feels like you have to get those results. But yeah, that's just how I see it.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting. So what I'm hearing, a kind of converging theme, and what I'm hearing is that nobody seems to be all one or all the other. That's present, but people you know who are successful, ambitious, driven, sometimes they exhibit one, maybe most of the time, but then other times, there will be some contexts, some situations where they'll counsel the other or where they'll sort of promote the other. And this is consistent with what the current received wisdom tells us about how we want to approach these two mindsets. Right. There's a lot of really good, really extensive, rigorous, well-developed literature across a bunch of fields that sort of converges on this idea that we should take a middle path. We don't want too much of one or too much of the other. There are times and places for each that we can kind of meld them together in a way that will be better than either. But it's not an either or, it's a yes and. We see this, these are just some different places where I know this comes up in different literatures, in case you're familiar with any, so for anybody who's come across dialectical behavior therapy within the psychology realm, Marshall and Ann, who's an incredible pioneer in her own right, builder of, a new approach to treating psychology. And, dialectical behavior therapy, the very name refers to this dialectic, this sort of trade-off, this synthesis of two seemingly opposing, contradictory parts, which are, accepting oneself on the one hand and changing oneself, changing one's behavior, changing one's circumstances in order to function better, to live a more meaningful life on the other. So there's this dialectic of acceptance and change. And similarly, this is actually also Marcia Lenahan. I owe great debt to her. So I gave her two whole lines in this spreadsheet. So she talks about the rational mind on the one hand, the emotional mind on the other hand, and that we can meld them together. So we have this wise mind that can sort of take counsel from both and then sort of come up with a decision by taking both into account. And then we have the whole parenting literature, if you're familiar with Von Rind and this kind of famous and well-studied triad of these three kinds of parenting. That you have authoritarian parenting on the one hand, which is cold and really structured and really wise, right? Like just high control, low warmth. And then you've got permissive parenting on the other extreme of this continuum, right? Which is very warm, but also unstructured and sort of low discipline, low accountability. You can take the best of both worlds and have a little bit of each in the form of authoritative parenting, where you've got the structure, but you also got the warmth. Similarly, you've all probably encountered this triad or someone has thought that if you had passive aggressive in there, right? These different communication styles where you've got aggressive communication on the one hand where, I win, you lose, I care about my needs, but I impose them on you and your needs don't matter, right? And on the other side, you've got passive communication, which is the other extreme where I care about your needs, but my needs don't matter. And then there's this middle one, this assertive communication, where again, it's like the best of both worlds. I care about my needs, but I also care about your needs. This is a very helpful framework, and I think it's much better to have this perspective than to not, right? Than to just be kind of stuck vacillating back and forth between these two ultimately not very, accommodating mindsets. But this is where I'm going to be controversial. This is where I'm going to sort of stake out a claim, and I'm deliberately going to sort of push against a lot of the received wisdom here. I'd love to hear, what you all think and get your pushback and feedback. But I just think these are all wrong. I don't think it's a continuum where you could have a little bit more, a little bit less, but it's all basically kind of, one dimension. I think that these are just wrong mindsets. There's something about them that's wrong. The whole way across. It doesn't matter how you try to blend them. I think that there's an underlying worldview that they share. It's the same, actually. At the bottom, there are two different ways of coping with this perceived state of affairs. Both of them assume, on some level, to varying degrees, but both of them assume this state of affairs. I'm going to contend that both of them have a pretty pessimistic view of the world. That whether you're, the drill sergeant trying to sort of push your way to defeating your foe, in effect, right? To kind of besting the enemy, to defeating the threat by fighting, or whether you're taking the Zen approach of sort of just withdrawing from the fight. The assumption here is that the world is a war zone. The world is a fight, right? And that there's not a whole lot we can actually ultimately do about it. Right? We don't have much control over what happens to us. We don't really choose the outcomes. The outcomes are kind of just set for us that, that you have to try to outcompete, the other guy for whatever scarce amount of resources are out there for us to divide up. And either, we're going to get more of the pie or they're going to get more of the pie. But one way or another, we're going to use up the pie. And it's a question of, does a dog eat dog, like which of us ends up starving, right? So it's a kind of mysterious world, it's a threatening world, and it's a world where we don't actually have much control. This kind of blind poetry, I think, captures the spirit of it, right? I, a stranger and afraid in a world I never made. Right? One of my favorite poets of all time, Elsman, I guess, also shares this too. At least he was in a mood when he wrote this poem, pretty sure. So there's this kind of zero-sum perspective here, right? That it's sort of, at the end of the day, you have to trade off. Either you can care for yourself, you can sort of tend to your well-being, keep from being too miserable, but at the cost of eating, at the cost of actually getting to the next rung of the hierarchy of the kind of success ladder. Or you can push to succeed, you can get to the next, milestone, but at the cost of your own misery, right? You can throw yourself under the bus, or you can kind of throw the rest of the world under the bus, right? You can be mindful of your own interests, you can be mindful of other people's interests, but not both at the same time. And maybe you can balance it out. Half the time it's about me and the other half the time it's about you. But either way, it's one of us is using up energy trying to listen to the other and the other one's doing the talking. And so there's again, there's a kind of fixed pot of resources and we're just fighting over how we divide it. And so one way or another, these two ways of coping are ways to deal with that problem, the problem of scarcity, right? And the problem of pain and suffering. We're both trying to find a way to just minimize the overall amount of suffering to achieve some sort of equilibrium where nobody's too unhappy or too starved. I think there's an alternative to this world. I'm going to call this alternative the builder's mindset. I'll be really curious how it compares to the entrepreneurial mindset that we teach it, that it exists in the literature. So I'm going to suggest that there's a different way of seeing the world. And of course, it's going to be for the philosophers later to debate over which of these is ultimately the right one or the other one the right one. How do you even legislate between worldviews? But I will claim that this is the worldview that generally seems conducive to being a happy builder. Happy, ambitious, fulfilled, uncompromising builder and creator. This is the view, this is the abundance agenda, right? We've been hearing about it in the news. This is the view that the world is raw material for our choice of what to build. It's raw material, right? So that also means that it's not going to give up its secrets to us for free. It's not going to come ready-made with buildings and skyscrapers. Those are buildings. And, and vaccines that protect us against pathogens, right? And cars and spaceships to take us to space. But it's going to be what it is. It's going to have certain natural laws, right, that operate on it. It's a causal, knowable universe. And if we work, and if we apply our intelligence, we can figure it out. And we can solve the problems and we can face off against the threats that we encounter in this world. The world is mine to win, to quote another poem that I think presents the kind of spirit of this world. And life is not a zero-sum game from this perspective. It's a kind of virtuous spiral of creating and enjoying what we create and making choices about how we want to spend energy in this time that we've been given on this earth to use it as we please. Right? And multiply the value, right? Leave the world more beautiful and more conducive to flourishing than we found it. Flourishing and our own flourishing, the flourishing of our children and grandchildren. So, speaking of Steve Jobs, right? If think when Steve Jobs designed the iPhone, I don't think, having read some of the history, some of the news at the time, kind of his own accounts of his thinking and people who worked at Apple during that era, I don't think he was primarily concerned. And I think you're actually quite right that I think he was probably prone to the drill sergeant. And I think that that's true of a lot of those sort of big name entrepreneurs here. When he's creating, like the things that he's most known for having given us, for having brought into the world, for having transformed our lives through his own ingenuity, I'm just thinking about not getting fired from Apple or about not getting out competed by Microsoft or like in fact he had already been fired from Apple when he learned that didn't kill him, right? So at this point it's sort of like, well, the worst happened, I'm still here. Now let me make the most beautiful ergonomic phone that I can imagine, using this tech that we've been tinkering with for other purposes where it wasn't quite a fit, but like I want to make a more beautiful phone that just fits so nicely in the palm of my hand. And I want people to be able to use it, and I want the world to be more beautiful in my way. That I think is the essence of the builder. But it kind of tears me up just thinking about it and thinking about that part of him and that part of every builder who has vastly improved all of our lives just by their ingenuity and curiosity and value creation. Now, I should say that I don't think the builder's mindset is only useful for entrepreneurs, right? Because at least if we mean in the narrow sense of people who start companies, right? I think it's applicable to every human being in virtue of being human and having this distinctive faculty of rational creation, of the ability to take raw material and transform it into beautiful, valuable goods that improve human life. And to choose and to invent new, unfathomable designs, right, upon the world that just didn't exist before. There was no pie, right? You just invent a pie. You invent a new kind of dessert that just nobody would have ever even been fighting over because it just didn't exist before you conceived it and then worked to make it real. Right? So it's really entrepreneurship in this wider sense that I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of this talk. But I also think if you cultivate this builder's mindset, it sets you up way, way better, A, for deciding whether the narrow sense of entrepreneurship, of like starting a company, is actually what you want to do at a given point in your life. And if you do decide that that's the path for you, given your goals and given your overarching life plan and what you want to see happen in the world during your days, this sets you up to deal with those very real challenges a lot better and enjoy doing it much more of the time. So with that in mind, I want to sort of sketch a bit more of a picture of how the builder's mindset offers an alternative. Like, what does it actually sound like and look like to sort of be embodying this mindset? How does it compare to the one we've already seen? So we've got this outcome process dichotomy, right? And you could be focused more on one or focused on the other. But I think that the builder's mindset sort of blasts that all down, because it doesn't differentiate between, there's this outcome over here, but there are these processes over there, right? A builder thinks in terms of causes and effects. I want to bring about a certain outcome. I want a beautiful piece of machinery that fits in my hand and that can be used to call people and to play music. How do I bring that about? What's the work, right? What am I going to have to figure out? Who am I going to have to hire? What kinds of, legal contracts am I going to have to navigate? And like, when I have a sense of like the scope of work that will be involved in building this, do I want it, right? That whole thing is the outcome that you're signing on to. The whole process is included in the choice. Your kind of current conception of what it's going to take, what it looks like to bring it about, is the choice of what you want to build. And if you've chosen it together with the work, to the extent that your model is, roughly correct, or roughly in line with what actually is going to need to happen in the world, you're going to want that work. You're going to love that work, even when it's grueling, even when it's grunt work, even when you also hate it, right? When you have to, Paul Graham who's written the definitive set of essays on how to be a founder, how to be an entrepreneur. It talks about doing things that don't scale right early in the life of a startup, where like you just have to call a bunch of people and try to get them to sign up for your app and try to get them to use it and do all these things that you wouldn't be doing as a founder later down the line. But like you got to do it. You got to get it started, and you've got to create that initial spark, right? You've got to hustle. You've got to spend sometimes, long days and nights just like reading through boring, legal documents, right? Figuring out like, how am I going to actually justify, using this space? And what are the risks, and who do I need to consult with to understand how to manage those risks, right? So a lot of it's going to be grueling. But it's in scope if it's what you need to do in order to get the thing you want to build, right? And if it's not, then you don't really want to build it, right? Maybe someone else should build it. Maybe you can, write up a proposal and send it out and send it to YC and hope that they'll sign it. Probably not how it works. Right, but if you want to build it, that means you're signing on to the work. And the same thing for people who seem all but I can, not go see it after this. It's very much a movie about building a concept. If you want to make it as a performer, right, as an actor, as a musician, you name it, but you're signing up for a long stretch of your life. You don't know exactly how long, and it could, there's a wide margin of error where you're going to be waiting tables and you're going to be auditioning, a million times a week and mostly getting rejected, and meanwhile taking voice lessons and dance lessons and acting lessons and you name it, what kind of lessons, and do rinse and repeat every day, right? And the people who really want it, they want that work, and it sucks sometimes, and sometimes they want to quit, and sometimes they struggle, and sometimes they wonder why they signed up for this. And then they remember, right? And in the movie, you kind of see some of those important junctures where, like, she remembers and he remembers, right? Like something kind of, that experience of, oh, okay, right, this is what I'm in it for. And often it's not having actually landed a part. It's like having that moment's connection with another actor, creating an experience, right, of a script coming to life in a particular kind of way, and really embodying the spirit of, a person that you have so admired and emulated, and now you've just sent it out into the world for others to see. Right? Yeah, that's part of the work. But if that's what you're building, you want the work, you love the work, and you don't just sign up for work that is grueling, or even maybe it's rewarding for someone, but like where you're just going through the motions, or you're doing it because other people do it, or because somebody told you that that's the way to climb the corporate ladder. Like, not if you don't see the connection to your goal. Why would I spend another 5 years in grad school when actually what I want is to write a book on this, and I know what I need to know, and I could just be writing it. Okay. Right? You're making choices not based on what is the conventional path or the cookie cutter, what is the existing recipe for other pies, right? Like you're thinking about your pie, the thing that you want to create, and what is it going to take. That's just on line one. We'll go over here to the so then you capture a lot of it. So what's the temporal focus of the builder? I think rather than thinking in terms of either, okay, I'm present focused, it's all about the now, or I'm future focused, I'm ignoring my current needs and mood and well-being for the sake of some future me. It's like there's a lifetime orientation. You really hear this from builders. You hear them talking, and it's like, okay, well, look, I'm 40 years old. I've got maybe 30 good years left, $30, 20 of which will be like my prime, and then I'll probably start to get, slower. Of course, the margins of error around all these things, but like given what I've got to work with, if I do this program now, that's going to be another 5 years where I'm learning a new skill, or I could be doing this other thing, and it's trading those things off against each other. What sort of life can I build if I focus all my energy now on doubling down on my strengths, right? And like going for, taking the job that I'm already at, the work I'm doing, but like approaching it more entrepreneurially versus starting over in another field, and like, what will that mean for my family? And what will that mean for the place that I live? Like, is that going to help me to build the life that I want? What is the vision of my life where I, take this time to do this time to do that, and what time will I have left over in the evenings, right? So thinking in terms of their life, that's the building project, ultimately. Ultimately, that's what a builder is building, building their life. They have a certain amount of it to work with. And so there's not this artificial distinction. They care about themselves now, they care about themselves then. It's all one self, it's all a continuous whole, and they're trying to make the most of it. How does a builder talk to themselves? And this is tricky because sometimes it can sound very similar. It can be subtle, and it really can be impossible to tell. Like if we had a little, bug in someone's brain, we could sort of hear one or two lines out of context. Like we could hear the same line, and for one person that could be builder mindset talking, and another it could be, any one of the other two. Because it depends on the context, right? The coaches where, like, we've all probably had the really amazing, inspiring mentors who, they would talk to us in pretty rude ways, and we knew what they meant, right? Like, dude, get with it, or, I was reading the Bill Campbell $1 Trillion Coach book, and there are examples of, like, his favorite line was, you need to get your butt out of your ass or something like that, right? But like this man clearly embodies a builder spirit and how he coaches. And there's so much of the description in this book. It's just so much like about this. It's about caring for the whole person and pushing the person to their form of greatness and really taking the time to figure out what that is for them, right? And this is how he talks. And people know what he means. And so it's the same thing with our own internal self-talk. Like, what do we mean? And what is the kind of underlying perspective and standard that we are invoking when we say to ourselves, like, get with the program, or come on, like, you idiot. I definitely say this to myself sometimes now, and sometimes now when I say it, I'm actually in a builder mindset. Sometimes I'm in drill sergeant mindset, I'll be honest, still a work in progress, right? But it's different now than it used to be. So it's even the same words, but it's like the context around them that's different. So on the whole, it's honest and respectful, and that can sound different depending on the context, but you know that that's the spirit in which it's meant. What about a builder's approach to work? That's where I think it's it can be hardest to tell. It can sort of look very like drill sergeant-y in that they work themselves like dogs, and they'll spend nights and weekends and forego sleep and forego food, and they'll just push so hard sometimes toward a goal. But it's when and because they really want to build the thing, right? And it's on their own terms and in their own time. And then when they need a break, they take a break. And that's really key, right? They're building their life. So it's not, if it's at the exclusion of their own sanity, their own focus, their own energy, that's not going to be a sustainable building project, right? Like the foundation will crumble, and it often does for people who take that kind of drill sergeant structure. They'll burn out, and then they'll just piece out of the company for a month and leave it to crumble, or kind of leave the culture to gradually decline because they just ran out of that borrowed energy of being driven by fear. Right. So it's relentless, but it's a relentless purposefulness, being driven forward toward a goal, toward something you've chosen and that you want. In fact, what about their thinking style? I think, again, this could sound in many ways similar to both but either of the other two, but I think that there's a distinctive set of properties, a distinctive nature to the way that a builder thinks, where they start from the world and they think deep and they think fresh about the world through their own eyes. And here I have to invoke Elon Musk. And we're just going to bracket the debate about his acquisition of Twitter and what any of us want to make of it, and his general, sometimes boorish behavior on social media. We're just going to set all that aside. The man popularized the term first principles thinking in Silicon Valley. Took it from Aristotle, as far as I can tell, straight out of Aristotle. He also really admires the physicists and the sort of enlightenment thinkers who kind of revived this approach to scientific thinking. And he applied it to entrepreneurship. He applied it specifically. One of the examples he uses is, when he first had the notion that, humans should really be like aggressively trying to get into space. Why aren't we doing that? Why is humankind, here we are talking about how we're using up our resources and the planet is going to die, but like, what are we doing about it? There's just all of this vast vast, unexplored, uncharted territory out there. Why aren't we exploring? It's what we do, right? We build, we chart new territory. So he wanted to somehow, he wanted to fund somebody to just privately build and man a spaceship to Mars, right? And so he started doing the research, like, well, why has nobody tried this? Why is it why does NASA, why do governments have this monopoly on this enterprise of sending humans to space? And he started to do the research, and the first question is, okay, well, how much for a rocket? You can't do it without a rocket ship. And his, new wacky research assistants went and they looked it up, and the market price of rockets, does anybody know? Does anyone know the story? It's like in the 30 million-ish range of US dollars for a rocket for one spaceship. That was the market price for within the aerospace industry. Most people at that point would just say, okay, you know what, now I get it. I see why this is a government thing. I'm just going to leave them to it. But Elon Musk, he thinks, why is it that much? How hard is it to build a rocket? What does it actually take? What are literally the raw materials of a rocket? And when he looked it up, what is the price of each part on the commodities market? It's made of this much carbon, this much aluminum, this much of these various parts. So how much just does the stuff cost? And then it can only be but so much more to assemble it, just by the laws of physics and the laws of human personnel and assemblage of large mechanical objects. And there's a ceiling on how much it can cost beyond the cost of the parts. And when he added it up, it was the whole amount of stuff that it would cost to build a rocket was 2% of the going price. Saying that, no, this makes no sense. We're just going to build our own. This is BS. We're going to just start from scratch. We're just going to build them. And SpaceX is born. Right? You've got to admire the kind of just the freshness and the depth of thinking, right? That just can apply such a kind of visionary perspective of just what do I know about the nature of stuff, the nature of building, right? Such that I can reconstruct for myself what it would take to create this thing. And then I can go do it. That's first principles thinking, right? Thinking about what is still going to be true 20 years from now, 50 years from now? It's an example, that Jeff Bezos uses when he was deciding about what to focus on, what should Amazon's priorities be, and what should it shape its culture around. We know a couple of things that are going to be true over time. We know that our customers are going to want cheap stuff, and they're going to want, easy and quick stuff, and those things aren't likely to change, right? We know that our customer, if we can't make our customers happy, then we can't be in business. Customer obsession. We're going to ignore other things. We're going to ignore, the competition and this tech and how fancy and how shiny. No. Customer obsession. That's the thing, because that is going to be a fundamental truth for us that's going to not change, right? That's what's going to be driving us a decade from now, just as it is today, right? That's what we're going to focus on. And he's looking out at what he actually knows. He's not, listening to, he's not kind of just taking existing frameworks and just applying them wholesale, right? He's kind of thinking fresh. And I think that that's a really distinguishing characteristic, especially of the entrepreneurs and kind of innovators, ambitious builders. And there's some other stuff. I can go through these quickly, and then you can ask me about any of them if you want to get into more detail. But I want to get to the last bit, which is how on earth do we build our own builder's mindset if we don't already perfectly apply it? I know very well. You can ask me about it. So we can kind of think about in further detail, what is the difference of how does a builder think about goals? How does a builder think about problems? Versus the tolerance of problems and failures. Invoked this before, right? That builders seem to be able to tolerate failure. They can put it in perspective. They know it's not the end of the world. They're on a growth and a learning trajectory rather than being obsessed with anything else. But that's because they can see the whole that they're building. So, right, they're not tunnel vision. This thing means that it's the end of the world. Relate to their work. And this is sort of counterintuitive, where you'd think, well, drill sergeants, they love work. They just want work all the time. I don't think they love work. That's not the sense I get. Even of myself, when I'm drill sergeant, it's not my loving of work, it's my hating of work and my punishing myself. like pushing myself to do it now and to be miserable. And yeah, that's right, you're gonna hate it and you're gonna, suffer so that later you can not have to work anymore. Right? So if you're trying to earn the escape from further responsibility in a way which never comes, because then there's always the next thing that you're supposed to try to prove yourself. But I don't think that we love work when we're in the certain mode. And similarly, when we're in Zen mode, we kind of distance ourselves from, we put in our day's work, but it's like it's not a big deal. We don't want to define ourselves. Like there's a New York Times article, recently with the headline, "What you do is not who you are." And there's been a lot of this kind of pushback, now that we're rethinking work and the great, what do you call it? Resignation. That's not anyway, right? And there's all this talk about like people have been taking their work too seriously. They've been too invested in it, too wedded to it. Like we need to help people to have better work-life balance. And then if you think about what that means, like this is the thing you in fact spend most of your life doing. The vast majority of your life is put toward your work. What do you mean it's not who you are? Like, don't you kind of want it to represent who you are? Don't you want your work to be meaningful and gratifying and connected to the other parts of your life? Right? Like it's the main chunk of your life pie, right? And so I think for a builder, like work is noble. Work is the experience of fully living, of building and creating the experiences and the values that you want to surround yourself with during your time on this earth. It's a very different way of relating to work. How we relate to fear when we're in builder's mindset. That's a useful signal. But Douglass writes about this too, right? Do you move toward or away from fear? Whereas I think the drill sergeant just like lives by fear and on fear. It's sort of just a steady state, and then we see the chronic stress and all the negative health effects, and constantly worried and constantly tense and neurotic. Versus the Zen mindset of like, oh, please just minimize this fear, minimize the stress. I can't have any more of this, right? I don't want it. It's aversive. It's bad for me. Versus like, ooh, why do I feel this niggling sensation of discomfort and unease? And I'm like, what am I missing? Right? Like maybe it's a false alarm, but maybe it's a true one, in which case, good thing I noticed it. Good thing I checked it out. I think this kind of follows from a lot of what you already said, right? Which is kind of the relationship to risk. And then there are some optional ones that kind of come back to if you want to ask me more about them. So what's the relationship with knowledge if you're on a builder's mindset? There's one that's actually hidden. What's your relationship with other people? Which I have a whole article about. Also. Okay, so how do we build the builder's mindset? Let's be honest, this picture that I've sketched of the perfect builder, it's aspirational for most of us. Now, I know a couple of people who I could almost say most of the time pretty much are this, but only a couple of them. And even they're probably, I could think of the occasional exception when something kind of triggers them into more of a drill sergeant and can kind of more of a tempo. The rest of us, we have work to do. Right? So how do we actually kind of re-engineer our own psychologies around this mindset and kind of make it, assuming you buy into it, right? That's step one. It's like, maybe you don't agree with me, but this is we live in this world where we actually have all this agency to create what we want to create. And that, the worst case scenario is, well, we run out of money and we kind of sit around and let the next virus come to get us, which is way worse than at least trying to solve the problem. We can have arguments with that. But supposing that it resonates, supposing you're considered judgmentally hung, there's really something to this mindset, and I want to be able to sort of internalize it, to make it part of me, to have it be my lens more of the time. That's a ways to do it, unfortunately. And psychology offers a ton of advice and guidance and science-based tools here. So no way I'm going to go into detail about all of them, but just to kind of preview some of the headings, we've got all the different tools by which to just build self-awareness of like, what are the mindsets that rattle around in my head at different times? What triggers these different ways of talking to myself? And when am mind one mood versus another, being able to actually sort of notice and take apart the different pieces out of which a mindset is composed, right? There's the sort of feeling, there's the kind of emotional and physiological piece, which is connected to a cognitive, like what are you actually thinking? How are you interpreting the situation piece, which also then motivates you to act in certain ways, which then tend to lead to more of the kinds of situations that made you believe that mindset in the first place. And so then it becomes kind of self-reinforcing. And once you start to notice all those different links in the chain and start to notice how you're feeling, how you're thinking, then you gain more and more agency over like pulling apart some of those double-headed arrows. Saying like, okay, I feel like this is going to be the end of the world if I kind of take this risk of going and having this uncomfortable conversation. But if I actually think about it, it didn't kill me last time. What's actually the worst that can happen? It's really good for me to push myself outside my comfort zone. So I'm going to try it. I'm going to see what, I'm going to feel a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety, but I'm going to go ahead and just push through that and have the conversation. Ooh, now you've done an action that will actually give you a different result than whatever your sort of Zen master and or drill sergeant worldview was sort of projecting, right, in the future where it's just going to be disaster and hopelessness. And now you're a little bit more confident the next time and build up that new sort of database of experiences that reinforce what you acted on to begin with. It's hypothesis testing in a way, right? So like you can start to act in ways that then help you to feel differently later, right? So just the core insight of cognitive behavior. And monitoring your self-talk, which we were already kind of sampling some of the ways to do that before, but like noticing what does your drill sergeant sound like? When does he come out? He or she come out to sort of like dominate your self-talk, and when do you kind of pull back and make excuses for, or try to kind of tell yourself it's all going to be okay and sort of not really look at some of the warning signals because you just don't want to have to feel all that stress and you don't deep down believe that you could handle it anyway. Whoa, hold on. That's my Zen mindset trying to save me from disaster, but I don't actually believe in that anymore. So let me just check it out, right? Just see what happens. And it's going to be really uncomfortable, but that's how you grow. That's how you build yourself. There are various ways, just like, if you're building a product, if you're building a company, a project, whatever, it's like you need to know what materials you're looking at. And that's your own mind, your own currency. Then you need a vision of like where you want to go, right? And similarly, there's a lot you can do to start developing your own sort of vision of like, what is the life I'm building? What are the kind of core ingredients of kind of life that I find most fulfilling, most satisfying, the kinds of results, the kinds of outcomes that I most, I'm well suited to and find satisfying to affect. Lots of different ways to learn about that, to explore it. Right? A, just what I was already talking about, practice working outside your own comfort zone. B, notice what happens when you're doing that, right? Maybe write it down, take some notes, data gather, and not just observe in the kind of Zen master's way, like bit by bit, snapshot by snapshot, and kind of connect to it, but also start to notice patterns, start to kind of articulate, like, what is the common denominator? Like, I feel really energized and really alive whenever I've just come out of, debate about a topic that I understand pretty well, but only with one of these people who actually seems non-defensive and really interested in it, versus I hate debating with, XYZ people who kind of turn it into an argument. There's something I really crave about that kind of thing. Where could I get more of that? And what is it about I'm actually I have this deep curiosity about current affairs or foreign relations or whatever, or science, and how do I seek out more opportunities to sort of build on that, think about it, right? So see how deep you can go in kind of describing yourself and describing your values and the things that you're like. And then put them into principles and into statements of purpose that can be applied to many of the particular moments in life, or the particular goal might change, but your mission is just using my argument, inspire and empower self-creation. Ambitious self-creation. You'll iterate on it and it'll evolve, right? As you learn more and more and actually know how to do it. But that's been pretty stable for me. And how I do it, whether it's by giving talks like this, by writing, by working individually, by working in groups, that's that's all a constant evolution, but I know what I'm doing with it. Like I know in general across a whole bunch of contexts, I am alive, I'm energized, I am living my fullest life when I can awaken and empower people's own internal drive to create themselves, to be great, right? And that's been a really helpful unifying framework for me in prioritizing, just spend my time on to what to do next. And then this is, I think, the last kind of practical point that I'll leave you all with. It's an important one because the fact is, we're not just going to be a builder mindset. Like, this is work. This is, for most of us, probably a lifelong project, really engineering or re-engineering our souls, our psychology around this kind of new perspective. That isn't the culturally dominant one, that's really kind of radical and non-mainstream. And so there's all kinds of messages, internal and external, that are pushing us in other directions. So what do we do with that? How do we manage that and keep moving forward? So the fact is, actually, psychology offers some really valuable levers of influence for being able to both shift kind of how we're relating to these kinds of emotions, even in the moment. You know, we're talking about like the shame, the guilt, the kind of guilt that isn't like the helpful guilt of like, hey, you're ignoring this important commitment that you made, and you're procrastinating on this like scary but really important email that you really need to respond to, right? Talking about the guilt of like, why are you spending so much time on yourself and your work when like there are all these people, you know, who are like when like your mom is mad at you for not calling more often, and when you were supposed to be an accountant and you just totally let her down and doing this weird risky thing instead, right? Or whatever form that takes for you. But like the kind of internal voice that you already kind of know in your considered judgment. Like, this isn't my endorsed view. I don't actually, like, I don't believe this guilt, but it's there. It feels bad. What do I do with it? Where do I put it? And there are lots of ways of trying to deal with it that actually aren't very helpful, though they are, you know, plausible to try, like trying to suppress it, trying to ignore it. Actually ends up making it worse. So psychology has really helped us out with this by providing a lot of useful tools for addressing it in a way that allows us to constructively move forward. So there's a bunch of cognitive tools where we can talk to it, we can dialogue with it, we can remind it of what we know. We can ask ourselves targeted questions like, what would 80-year-old me think is important? How big a deal will this seem to my 10 years from now self, 80-year-old self? Or how would my builder friend sort of understand the situation, right? Or like, what is actually the worst case scenario here? Right? Like, what is the upside? Because I know I tend to ignore upside when I'm in this like really anxious, triggered mode of being really afraid to lose or to take a risk. So like, let me just really try to articulate and maybe quantify the upside to find, if this actually works out, and then how is that bigger or smaller than the downside, if it doesn't come through. There are also just behavioral tools. Again, there's just doing the thing, right? There's acting counter to your own feeling in ways that like deliberately kind of just pushes in the opposite direction. It's actually called opposite action. Invoke Marshall the panic actions. Full of very practical tools that we can for these situations. And it can just pretty quickly kind of cut through at least the intensity of the feeling. Physiological levers. We can just really quickly kind of ramp up or down the intensity of our emotional state by doing things like holding an ice cream. It just kind of like signals our whole nervous system to calm down. Taking deliberately deep breaths. We can get ourselves pumped up on the flip side if we're feeling the kind of Zenish like, just don't, I feel heavy and I don't want to have to do this again. I don't want to pain, like pumping ourselves up, right? So we can kind of use these, dials in both directions when we know what we're aiming for, right? It's really key to realize that, a lot of the things we do to deal with our emotions turn out to be more the cause of our suffering than the emotions themselves. And so actually tools that help us lay off of some of that unconstructive stuff, like engaging with the troll, right? Like with your own inner troll. Like having an argument with it, and it's the same argument that you've had many times, but it keeps coming back, and it's like, oh yeah, but have you thought about this? And you're like, yeah, and then it comes back, and it's like the argument never ends, because that's what happens when someone's trolling you. They They're always having that but. It's just the same thing. They don't mind repeating themselves. It's the same thing in our own head. So realizing like, wait, this is the troll. You know what? It can sort of chatter in the background, but I'm actually going to get back to this thing that I'm working on that I know is really important right now. Just widening your attentional frame, widening your perspective to sort of encompass all the other things that you know and all the other things that matter to you and that you can have thoughts about. It's okay that little troll is taking up a little piece of your overall attention span, but you know, it doesn't have to take up the whole screen. So to kind of sum up, like what are the kind of core messages that you get from the synthesis of a bunch of these different research-based strategies, levers of influence? I think it's to feel your feelings rather than try to suppress them, ignore them, shut them down. And just as importantly, to zoom out, right, and see around the feelings and see all the other things and get the perspective that you might otherwise be missing. And keep pushing forward, to keep doing what you know, to keep acting on what the kind of common phrase, fake it till you make it. I think it's sort of getting at this whole idea that like you can take action based on your considered judgment and your feelings will catch up. But I hate the phrase fake it till you make it. You're not faking it. The feeling is the faker. You're actually acting on your conviction, on your knowledge, on your really deeply considered perspective that, wait a minute, the world is full of opportunity. The world, like, I live in a much safer world than most of my ancestors. And the worst case scenario is nearly as bad as what I could gain by actually going for my shot. Right. So we're going to just breeze through the self-trust section because I've already spoken so much and been so much on this topic. You're welcome to just check out stack multi-part articles about the importance of self-trust. Long story short, kill your sacred cows. You don't have room for them on the road to building what you want to build. These can be any of the things that we kind of tell ourselves to cope usually with the perceived threat and the perceived, you know, mystery and unknowableness of the world, right? Like, well, I found what I'm meant to do and it's what will define me forever and it's where I've staked my self-worth and so I couldn't possibly turn out to have actually picked a bad path that's not within my realm of consideration, so I'm just not going to go there. That's not a hypothesis I'll consider, right? Or I've like already put so much time and energy and I'm already this far into my degree or this far, you know, this job. It couldn't possibly be that I've been on the wrong. Right? Like that I've wasted all these resources, classic sub-cost factor. Or like I've poured so much into this house that turned out to be a dime, but no way I'm going to admit that it's done now. So I'm just going to keep pouring even more of my wealth and resources into this wasteland, right? Don't do it. Life's too precious. You've got too much to do with the powers of building that you still have vested in. And take pride in being honest with yourself about the painful stuff that's hard to admit, that's, you know, the sacred cows that are hard to kill. Because that's what a builder does. And that's actually you being a builder. That's actually what you want to stake your self-esteem on. Because actually that's what's going to help you enjoy the rest of the days. So finally, I just want to invite you to think about who are the builders who inspire you. And what would it look like for you to sort of invoke that when you really need to activate this mindset to kind of make it real to yourself? And just taking some examples from my own roster of formidable builders. But this is a little bit of a kind of recency bias. You know, I'm indexing on sort of some of the recent exemplars that I've been thinking about. But anybody know who this woman is? So this woman, just to give you a quick taste of her story. So she's a American-born immigrant scientist who, for 40 years, worked as some mix of like lowly, like postdoc, assistant professor, demoted again to untenured person, working in other people's labs in the university, never getting a grant for her far-fetched, too out there idea that you could take mRNA and somehow use it to create immunity against infectious diseases. And she just kept at it. She never got paid more than $60,000 a year for those 40 years of her life. That she didn't know there was going to be a pandemic, that it was ever going to actually get wrecked, right? But she really wanted to figure it out. And eventually she got super entrepreneurial with it. She quit her academic position finally and went to work for a biotech company where she was senior scientist, or like where she could get some more stuff done and find another way to get some of it funded, but like never through the normal channels, never without really much respect from any of her colleagues, from any of her mentors. She just kind of kept at it. She wanted to build it. And now, of course, she's rightly hailed as one of the heroes of the pandemic who's delivered us, right? The ravages of COVID-19. Just imagining, like, she didn't know she would get to this point. So what was it like to be her? What were those choices along the way where she could have just switched to a different topic? She could have just done something easier, more fundable, more sexy. I mean, and like scientists have this kind of trade-off to deal with every couple months, years, days, you know, like the end, really doing weird stuff, right? That just like isn't the current, isn't on the list of the NIH funding priorities, right? At this time, or probably I'm like, what do you do, right? Do you just take the easier path, go with the flow, right? Do you drill sergeant your way to having tenure, being, having the kind of status of somebody respected in the field at the cost of not actually getting to answer the questions and build the technology that excites you? Or you just keep at it. She's a pretty happy lady. From the issues that I've listened to, from the stories of him, I think she loves her life. I think she's loved it all along. I don't think at any point that she changed mind, and I'm sure it was frustrating, right? I don't think that's what it was about for her. I emulate her example. I'm glad that, she's alive and well, not only for the obvious reason that I can my life, but also because now I know that that's possible, and I have a model to follow. We're not going to spend as much time on him. We've already talked about him a little bit. But I wanted just to bring up Elon because there was a personal connection recently enough when he overnight, in response to a Ukrainian administrator, like high-ranking government person, beseeching him on Twitter, basically, hey, you talk the big talk with all your, fancy innovations, but like, why don't you make Starlink your pioneering space satellite technology for providing really high speed internet? Why don't you go make it available to Ukrainians who right now, in the middle of this horrific war, are like at risk of getting cut off from the world? And 12 hours later, he tweeted, okay, done. And it was. And this is a photo of Ukrainian citizens using Starlink internet to access the outside world and keep us all posted. And get the resources. So that's Mensch, right? And then this is not a guy who's like had a really kind of straight path to success. Clearly, like the guy's hated by at least as many, if not more people than love and revere him. That's been true since apparently, in middle school, like all of these grade school years, surprise, the guy was bullied and didn't have an easy time of it growing up in South Africa and being an immigrant, again, kind of going through all sorts of hoops and like learning martial arts when he was, I think, 15, so he could deal with all these bullies and probably, developing a little bit of inner drill sergeant, or at least certainly outer drill sergeant, and just an outer troll, at least on social media, to kind of deal with it all. Man, delivered such immense life-altering value, just so many, and like just everything else kind of fails by comparison. And then to really kind of swerve in a different direction, but just someone who I keep coming back and discovering a new level, is like, wow, how little do we all have to complain about? So this is Frederick Douglass, who in history, he was literally born and raised a slave. He taught himself in secret how to read and write by trading food for lessons from white kids, in the neighborhood. Like, talk about an entrepreneurial spirit. Right? Eventually, he escaped from his slave owners at age 20. He founded his own newspaper. He also had a real estate business. The guy was, among other things, definitely an entrepreneur. And ultimately, he built one of the most inspiring and intellectually brilliant and sweeping oeuvres of abolitionist pro-freedom thought and oratory of the whole history. So just think of the courage, the intellectual independence and perseverance, right? The kind of conviction, the honest conviction and loyalty to your convictions that these people have to muster, right, in order to do what they've done. Right? And then ask yourself, as I sometimes do when I get complaining, like how insurmountable are the challenges and the obstacles that are in our way of building things and taking the risks, doing the hard work, right? And what risks would we like to reflect back on when we're 80 or 100 years old and thank ourselves? With that, I thank you all. And have any questions? Yeah.
Dr. Rowland, thank you very much. This was really great, very inspirational. I'm wondering if you have any insight as to how parents can help instill build their mindset into their children, help their kids develop that sort of thinking.
That's a great question. I feel like it's sort of a planted question for my husband, Matt, who is here, but I know he's in spirit and has much to say on the topic because he's a Montessori educator. But I can briefly say it's such a good thing you're asking that question because that is the easiest time to do it, right? And between sort of Montessori thought and pedagogy and between some of the work of just some of the thinkers within the kind of parenting literature who developed ideas around authoritative parenting and around there are books that I wish I had off the top of my head that maybe others in the room can help me with.
That guy.
Yes, do you remember the name of the book?
How to talk so kids will listen.
Yes, thank you. And listen so kids will talk, right? I think that, and I say that having not actually done it myself. I feel as though I've absorbed it by osmosis from people close to me who swear by it and I clearly have sort of absorbed. There are some basic principles that I think will echo a lot of what we just talked about in a broader context. Like the way we hope our kids will grow up to talk to themselves. That's the way we want to be talking to them, right? So like holding them accountable and really honoring. Remember the self-awareness section, right? That was the first thing we needed to do if we want to engineer our mindset. Like we need to learn about our kids. We need to model that kind of curiosity and we need to help and give them both the space and the structure to get to know themselves, to spend time in focused work and concentration. One thing I didn't mention because I didn't have time to Google it and see if someone's actually done a study, but I bet I would hypothesize that on a sort of disproportionately high number of successful entrepreneurs played with Legos when they were young, or some equivalent, just like they spent a lot of time just building stuff. Right? Or like sand castles, or just like working with their hands, coordinated by their mind, right, on purposeful activity where they're creating something of beauty and of functionality, of value through focused work, right, through concentration. And Montessori is the scholar and the scientist, the practitioner who had the most to contribute to developing the science of that. And so reading The Absorbent Mind, reading a lot of the work where she kind of describes her method, and then there are now books for parents that kind of translate it into the home. The Montessori infant, Montessori toddler, I don't know how high it goes, but those are also great. Basically, yeah, I would be sort of talking to people in the kind of Montessori world who are thinking seriously about how to foster pretty much, like I think we're simpatico Montessori. I think she's fostering the builder's mindset. She uses different words for it. That's right. Questions or reactions, pushbacks, disagreements, which I really want to hear.
I just had a question about the process and outcome. Or can't quickly find it.
I can go.
If I remember correctly, so you wrote down outcome via process. And one thing that I've always thought about, because I think there's something definitely right to the idea that there's something wrong about, yeah, there we go. There's something wrong about each of those, you know, if you're only focusing on what you're doing at the moment and you sort of, you're kind of checked out with regard to your outcome, you can't really grow because then you're kind of ignoring signals perhaps that you're not doing something in the right way or the most productive way.
Yeah.
But if you're so obsessed with the outcome that you hate the process, or that, you know, it's like you're only obsessed with something that comes later or something that's in the future, you can't appreciate your own growth. I guess, do you think it's part of the builders, like when you say outcome via process, would one way of cashing that out be thinking of it as, well, you have goals, but the goals are for the sake of enjoying a certain kind of process and appreciating the process.
That's interesting when you put it that.
Well, and the reason I put it that way is because I do think the Zen mindset, I guess if we want to put it that way, there's something true about the fact that it seems to me right to think that you do only experience the present. I mean, you can experience the past through memory, I guess, but
Those who live
in terms of like,
no, those who work for the future live in it today. Fight. Those who fight for the future live in it today. But I mean, I think there's also a lot to what you're saying.
yeah, and I guess, and when I think about goals, like, you know, so I'm a musician and I think about things like, okay, I'm going to make an album. But, so I have that goal, but I want to enjoy the process of making it. And that's what I'm really going to experience. I mean, there is going to be a moment when I say like, I'm done. That moment is over very quickly and it's not that important.
Yeah, no, that's
So like, but I need the goal of it to structure what I'm doing, because if I didn't have that goal, if I was just, you know, recording things randomly, I wouldn't have like the ability to appreciate it as this integrated thing that I come out with in the end.
yes. So
Do you think that's, yeah?
yeah, so I think you're getting at something really key, which is the point is it's not this being the real one and this being the means, or that being the real one and this being the means. The point is like they're one thing, and ultimately the life is the thing, and life is an activity, right? So it's not some discrete stop ultimately along the way. Like all of these things are in service of building a certain kind of life, and your life is a continuous thing that happens for, you know, some 60 to 100 or so years, and then it ends, right? And so in a way, the ultimate outcome is, did you make the most of that? And I think what we need discrete stopping points, and these are, you know, we need sort of like purposes and organizing kind of, I feel like this is where I want to invoke some of the philosophers' wisdom on just sort of the way that constitutive idea of, right, like a life being both the end and the means to itself, that actually you can't kind of fully pull them apart. Because yeah, I mean, even if we think about like ends that we go at, like my end when I was, you know, training to be a psychologist was to get to be a psychologist. Is that a discrete, it wasn't to get the diploma. Like the diploma is worthless without what it actually then enables and what it represents, which is now I have this, you know, foundation of knowledge and skill that I now get to spend my life doing this thing that I love to do. So in a sense, the outcome is another, you know, an opportunity to get to do more of this process. But the process is also a process of creating things that are now things that exist in the world, like, you know, the music, the work of music, the composition. ideally want to spend your life making things you really enjoy making. But part of what you enjoy about them is that you're making them, right? And that they add up to something. So I think we could go in that.
Yeah, and then just really quick, I think even the objects we create, I think you can even have the perspective on that too, because no object exists just for the sake of being a created object. We create things for the sake of consuming them and appreciating them. So even you could say like an album is like, if no one's listening to it, if it's just there, it's kind of pointless. It's also the process of like recognizing it and appreciating it, like even once it's created.
Yeah, so I guess this is what I mean about the sort of lifetime orientation, right? Like when you have, there's that next one, right? The lifetime orientation. It's like all of these individual parts are parts of a whole. And the whole was your life and concerns and everything that's sort of part of your life, and including at least maybe one generation out if you do have kids, or if there are people you're going to leave behind who, like, while you're alive, you really care about their fates, right? And you want to see the world be a certain way because it's your world and you're invested in it, and you want to leave it in a beautiful and founded or whatever. Like all that, it's part of one integrated project, which is your life. So I think trying to pick out any one of those things, like this is the thing and you should hang your hat on this thing at the exclusion of the rest of your life, would be taking it out of context. Does that make sense? I feel like maybe we went off on a Chris, I have a question. Please.
Is the builder mindset accessible to all people regardless of their intelligence? I've worked with people who really struggle to, like, you have to train them every single step and they can't create for themselves. They're not necessarily creative types. So how does that sort of person become more of a builder?
So I think the answer is that it's truer, at least for a far wider range than we tend to believe, that I think is the sort of default assumption. And that range encompasses people we think of as having like mental retardation, an IQ less than 70, and they are really, really concrete. People who have pretty severe mental health disorders, people who have lesions where now they are, they have a really hard time putting things into words, right? People on the autism spectrum who, like, previously in other eras, we would just like given up on them as, oh, they're not verbal and they're not really, they're not all there. But then we like find the technology, we find the right way to interface with their internal world. And like, they're writing poetry and they're telling us about their like memories of being nonverbal, but feeling really stuck inside. And, and that's a kind of very particular kind of circumstance where it turns out this person isn't dumb at all. They're just sort of, trapped in a kind of different way of communicating. But like if you think about the sort of fundamental building blocks of building, it's like you've got to be able to do things with your mind and with your kind of physical effort that help you, right, to kind of sustain your life and to be able to kind of do more things. And if you think about the wide range of ways that people can do that and have done that, and how much actually easier it is to find niche opportunities for people to do something like that now than it might have been before technology and before monetary automation, I feel like and this also applies for, like, it's harder or easier to develop a builder mindset depending on lots of things beyond our control. We had severe trauma growing up, which would make it really hard to even consider, much less sort of actively embrace the perspective where, like, you can take risks and people aren't going to walk all over you and people aren't going to just, and you're not going to be sort of destroyed and stomped on and, intolerably hurt in the process, right? Or just certain genetic predispositions to mental health disorders, to, just kind of neurotic temperaments that just make us a lot more emotionally vulnerable or volatile. And we have really, really good evidence that across the whole range of those things, you can use a lot of the same techniques and you can get better than you were, and you can get braver than you were, and you can get more industrious than you were, and you can get more efficacious than you were. And that there's not sort of a smooth cutoff where, oh, well, you're too concrete. And the fact that we see 2-year-olds, I see my 2-year-old being a builder every day, and I see her applying her intelligence, such as it is as a 2-year-old, to figuring out how to make the little shape that she puts on the sand in the sandbox, like actually turn into an elephant. And then it brings her tremendous joy. And then she goes and figures out what else she can do with that thing, and then like makes up whole weird little stories out of the different Disney characters that she's encountering. Like she's barely, she's very concrete. And if God forbid, for some reason, she were like to freeze there in her development, she would still be able to like come up with more stories and to develop more skills and to do the kinds of things that I think at her level and, given her capacity, with respect to her capacity, they engage her and challenge her and they push her forward. They fight, she's alive, she's vital, and she's helping herself. So, and I've seen it with, people with psychotic disorders. I've seen it with people who are inpatients at, psychiatric wards because they're suicidal and it's really hard for them to get out of bed. And I've seen them push themselves out of bed, and that's their assertion of the capacity to build that day. And then the next day they're able to take a walk in the hallway. And so I think part of it is just really like taking seriously that this is an individual person and we need to put more there at. But if we can do that, I think that there's a pretty wide. Does that answer your question?
Pretty much. I mean, I was thinking more in the workplace than mental disorders, but like,
Sorry. That's where my mind
but just, some people don't approach their work necessarily as I'm building something from scratch. I seem very creative, like a lot of us, but they still enjoy it and they still have goals.
Well,
I don't know.
I wouldn't say that they're not. Yeah, but I think that's part of it's like not everyone has to be an entrepreneur in order to be a valuable. There's plenty of room to be a builder within the scope of, like a very particular job where there's a lot of structure. But like if that's actually engaging your intelligence at whatever level of that, and where you feel energized and engaged and challenged and you're growing, right? Which I think sometimes people do something they don't, right? In a job like that, and we can help, we can watch for that, and we can sort of be really sort of sensitive to people's kind of roles and like, wait, are you still learning the way that you were a year ago? Are you frustrated because it's too hard? Not or because I'm not getting the right sorts of inputs. So I think again, it still comes down to sort of to some extent. And some people have free will, so they may still not be builders even when you do everything right. But in principle,
I think it's worth thinking about a sort of meta builder mindset where you use a builder mindset to decide what to build.
Yeah.
Is that a separate question?
Yeah, totally. So that's like basically a description of what I was going for with my whole catchy building the builder's mindset. I think. Is that what so do you mean like building the building mindset? But I guess you're asking more about like, what do I want to build? Well, how do I approach that as a builder? Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the same principles apply. So like, are you actually gathering your own independent judgments and observations about what you enjoy and what your strengths and weaknesses are? Are you being honest with yourself about those? And are you going out and trying stuff, right? Or are you kind of just cogitating in your head on, well, I could be a rock star, and you're like thinking 20 years down in the future, but really you're still in your parents' basement smoking pot. Right. So I think there's a builder's mindset and a non-builder's mindset, right, of making that decision for sure. And that's a lot of what I work with people on. Certainly when I worked with like younger high school to college, or failure to launch, which is why the kid in the basement sort of not having gotten a job, but having just come back home and gotten stuck with maybe on like at the video game console comes to mind. Because like that person like needs their builder's mindset revved up in service of like figuring out what the heck they want to do and like going and starting to do some stuff. Doesn't matter what almost, right? But you gotta start somewhere. Just like go push yourself past your comfort zone. Like work at Walmart. I don't care. Like work with your hands and see yourself actually creating something of value and having that add up to something useful, seeing a paycheck in your hand at the end of the day and experience the reward of that. Then that we'll, give you ideas for what to do next. But like, my husband will be like, how can I build a cabinet? That's his answer for everything. It's like, whatever problems, no home sorters, trauma, whatever. He's like, I should go build a cabinet. But like, sometimes he's right. They do need to go build a cabinet. You need that experience of building something. So, yes.
I really appreciate this metaphor and your presentation, so thank you so much. In an effort to kind of answer your question, I guess like an entrepreneurship minor, like our goal is to teach the entrepreneurship mindset or the builder's mindset. And my personal experience was I didn't feel good enough for the business school. I was told I wasn't smart enough. I couldn't pass that darn calculus class. And so I got weeded out in my undergraduate, even though I came from a long line of actually builders. My grandfather started a home building company in the 40s. So in my 20s, I had really struggled, and I very much identify with the sergeant. But one of the things that we hope to teach in the minor and across the 40 acres, as we move from 24 in our rankings to in entrepreneurship to 4 most recently, is this idea that like, what defines a founder and what defines a builder, what defines entrepreneurship, and we wrestle with this question of, can you teach entrepreneurship, right? And what's really exciting about our program is we open up the business school to any and all majors. So we have over 100 majors in our program, and so those that are super intimidated and have a limited understanding or limited view of what an entrepreneur is, because most people think it's business based. And I just have a recommendation for you and everyone. I've been watching Julia on HBO Max, which is the story of Julia Child, and I wasn't that intimately familiar with it. And as somebody who, my dissertation was about storytelling and entrepreneurs, but being able to expand people's definition of what it means to be entrepreneurial or creative. And it's just a fascinating story of just cooking, right? And how, like, particularly episode 3, there's been 6 or 7 episodes. Like, it talks about how she solves this problem of, wait a minute, this recipe takes 2 hours to make. How the heck are we going to do this in 28 minutes? And there's this whole amazing episode of her trying to figure that out. And I just think it's a really wonderful way to end your presentation with these 3 different stories of these entrepreneurs who are completely different, and that you can approach that mindset from a million different ways. And it's just something that I hope that we can invite as many people to participate in as possible.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I couldn't have said it better. I think go watch Julia. I don't know if any of you have seen Julie and Julia, which is a film that.
Yes, this is, you'll like this.
Oh, I'm so excited. Okay, thank you. I know we've just about stretched I don't know what my official charter was as to the end of time, but all for your attention. Yes, did you want to?
Just really quick. It is kind of segueing with that anyway. It seems to me that I guess we might expand the concept of entrepreneur to include things beyond business. That'd be one way to think about it. Something that struck me is that the strength of the entrepreneur model, we're thinking of it that way, that's applied to a personal life for someone who's not in business, essentially, is that, well, those individuals are tremendously creative and they need to have that to succeed. But it seems to me that what you're really talking about is more just creativity that can apply beyond entrepreneurship. And one of the key sort of domain, I guess, that I was thinking that where that's clearer is when we're thinking about ways in which you can adopt a builder mindset to things that aren't necessarily products that you create, that you trade economically. So it might be things like increasing the aesthetics of the space you live in, or increasing skills that you have that just make your life more enjoyable, even if you're not using them in your career, and working on friendships and things like that.
Being entrepreneurial about how you date. Sort of
right, relationships,
right? It's like, do you kind of just wait
to bump into someone, or
Right.
especially in the day and age where like we have these apps that have all of these tools that you can use to try to customize them to, data gather, like do you really lean in and try to optimize for the data you're gathering and go on a bunch of dates and, really try to iterate. That's being an entrepreneur. Absolutely. Yeah. So I think there's definitely a wider approach to life that is in certain ways exemplified by entrepreneurs in a narrow sense, but also that we want to remember like that's not the only model and that's not the right model for everyone. But being intentional, purposeful, and just kind of seeing the world through your own eyes, right? In whatever areas of your life, not just taking the status quo for granted, but kind of thinking fresh about what you need and how to build it. Across this. Thank you all so much.
Thanks everyone for coming.